Bonjour, et notre visite avec notre John de la Louisiane. Good morning, everybody. This morning I would like to continue our discussion about the origins of Louisiana's diverse food culture and our two linguistic traditions. They're all tied, of course, to a context that's much greater than the American state of Louisiana and much bigger than black or white. We have to remember that before the Louisiana Purchase of Louisiana in 1803, Louisiana was not limited to the state of Louisiana, created in 1812. Louisiana was La Nouvelle France, New France, or an undeclared French Indian or Métis nation. Dr. Carl Eckberg of Illinois has done some interesting studies in this regard, and fortunately and very intelligently and so much needed, ties that group of people in the Illinois Territory to its Louisiana cousins appropriately and Louisiana descendants. You see, the Vidrines of Louisiana, the Sauciers, the Ardouins, the Catois, and so many others were first Illinois Creoles before they came to the territory of Orleans after the 7 Years' War in 1763, along with their Alabama Métis Creole cousins, Fontenot's, LaFleur's, Gilry's, and so many more that I talk about all the time. But that Louisiana territory, or undeclared French Indian nation, extended upward to the shores of Quebec and Canada, incorporated parts of the Great Lakes states around Michigan, parts of the Midwestern states, down here to New Orleans, and eastward to Pensacola, Florida. It was an extension of the French colonial world and empire that had spread from the Indian Ocean to West Africa to here at the forgotten corner of the Gulf of Mexico. And of course, across this former empire sailed varieties of men, ideas, social and culinary traditions, which found their way to lower Louisiana and whose existence remains a faded memory, but fossilized in the very old language tradition of Louisiana French and its daughter tongue of Coury-Veni. Louisiana French itself is a composite of Languedoc, medieval French, classical French, its ancestors, and later modern French elements, which bear testimony to the successive waves of French migration to Louisiana. And in Louisiana, as I mentioned, a Coury-Veni daughter Creole was also born within the context of Louisiana's unique people and circumstances. Louisiana's two language traditions remain a strong reflection of the much older French colonial Creole noted by Dr. Margaret Marshall, and of which Gabriel Debian and René Le Gardeur made such beautiful mention, and very evidently kindred to the Creole French of Réunion, Mauritius, notwithstanding the expected differences of ethnocultural and geopolitical factors which differentiate them. In the words of Gabriel Debian and Gardeur, he said, known as Crioulo, or Creole, it diversified into a complete language as it diffused from the Indian Ocean to the Cape Verdes to Senegal, and from the Guianas to Martinique, Saint-Domingue, and New Orleans. A sort of lingua franca, of the South Atlantic, binding the French maritime world together across great expanses of land and sea. The first level of Louisiana creolization, or métissage, begins, therefore, with the interracial marriages of the French and Canadians in Lower Louisiana, Basse Louisiane, known in the 18th century, now parts of or entire parts of modern American states of Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, and Pensacola, Florida, to the Muskogean family, Choctaw Creek, and other related indigenous peoples who, in terms of numerical population and through intermarriage, slavery, or concubinage, known as mariage de pays, across the French colonial world, both dominated the social, domestic culture, and ultimately the racial makeup of which produced the Creole-metis, or Canadian and Euro-French Amerindian population. The first Africa-originated slaves were men. When these men arrived in New Orleans for the building of the city, they were not exclusively African. That's an overgeneralization. Modern scholarship has specified and clarified that amongst this African population or collection of slaves were evidently Asian, Carib, Amerindian captives who were sold along into this classification and group of people who ultimately came to Louisiana. They too, these African-originated slaves, were men and necessarily inhabited and cohabited with indigenous peoples, enslaved indigenous, and evidently with Creole-metis women whose offspring the Spanish referred to as grief. As often seen in Louisiana's Spanish-era succession records, their words are part of my list and part of our history that is shown here in my book, Their Words, Their Gifts, and Their Hands, Louisiana's Creole Food and People. They tell us who our ancestors were. It's not as simple as black or white. In fact, Louisiana's indigenous culinary traditions were preserved and transmitted to their Afro-Creole-metis descendants and to all other groups of Louisiana's diverse Creoles, whether they know it or not. That's why I've had to do this work, to point out, to give the proof, the evidence for the métissage which has been downplayed or suppressed by those who are obsessed with everything Africa or those who are obsessed with everything Cajun. We have to tell the truth, and the truth can never be myopic. It cannot ignore what was here before and focus only on one group that came later or after, and groups of which did make contributions, but not the ultimate contributions, and certainly not responsible for the creation of the earliest component of the culture of Louisiana. To ignore this, as I've said before, denies the honest inquirer, as well as our people, our children, access to the rich layers and foundations of what created Louisiana's unique food culture, social traditions, architecture, people, and our linguistic traditions. Still later, with the arrival of African women, Spanish-speaking Latins, Malagueños, Catalan, Isleños, Mexican, Acadian, Haitian, and 19th century ethnic influences, a vast and diverse mixed-race Latinate Creole population, or gumbo people, was created, in the words of the famous Sybil Kane. This ethnic diversity is evident in the enrollment of the diverse Creole female students of the Ursuline Convent in New Orleans, as provided by Dr. Emily Clark's research, and seen also in the baptismal records of the St. Louis Cathedral, where the Spanish introduced their labyrinthine racial taxonomies carried into French, Gris, Pardo, Quadroon, Octoroon, Mulat, and so forth. And appropriately in New Orleans, the menu likewise diversified greatly. The cultural and commercial influences, however, did reach the rural areas, too, where this menu would remain remarkably stable, simple, and unchanged. The menu later relabeled Cajun after 1968's mass marketing, relabeled everything in the country Cajun, even though the Cajuns, for the most part, were not allowed to settle in that area during the Spanish period. Truth is stranger than fiction. I will continue the discussion with a look at the foodways that came to be part of Louisiana's rich tapestry. I like to refer to this as the many hands in the pot. Is it with reference to gumbo? Our culture's an appropriate metaphor for our culture. Its diversity is gumbo, that delicious Louisiana soup, a gift of the Indians and the Africans. Is it févi or filet gumbo? Well, the many hands in the pot show it's both. Many scholar historians and early food writers share the same studied and well-documented view that Louisiana's cuisine evolved from cross-cultural marriages of the Euro-French, Amerindian, Muskogean, Afro, Latin, Caribbean peoples, or Creoles, with later contributions of the Spanish, German, Italian, and Irish peoples. Under Louis XIV, despite slavery, interracial marriages were encouraged, as seen in the earliest Code Noir, or Black Code of 1685, which document governed the French colonial world on the basis of the shared Catholic faith, the identity of a Frenchman in colonial times. That was the basis, as well as the colonial French language across the former colonial French Empire, that united these greatly diverse peoples into one remarkable multi-ethnic tapestry or fabric. The later anti-miscegenation modifications to the Code Noir and much later Anglo-American racial apartheid had not yet been born. Interracial relations were as normal as any among men and women, as they've always been in Europe. Perhaps the most famous French historian of Louisiana's colonial history, Marcel Giraud, in addition to the testimony of American and Louisiana native scholars, acknowledged the food and culture of Louisiana to be based largely upon the Choctaw Amerindian methods, or Creole, meaning no longer French continental. In early sources such as André Pénicaud, Charles Duprat's Bossu, we see more of the early Creole-metis menu. Like its inhabitants, the culture was something newly created, an evolving product of the New World, comprised of multi-ethnic influences no longer authentic to the French or other Old World models. West African slaves were not present in Louisiana until limited importation began in the early 1700s at Mobile for agricultural development, and later accelerated for the building of New Orleans in 1718 through 19. Excuse me. But it was not until the 1720s that both men and women were being imported into New Orleans. Enslaved African men arrived in 1718 to help build New Orleans. Enslaved Native Americans were already present, but the African Aborigines did come, and they would become the new custodians of Louisiana's unique but evolving Creole cuisine and diversification of her people. Theirs would be the hands in the pot for a very long time. According to the late Louisiana scholar-lawyer Louis Nordini, his History of Grant Parish, Louisiana, the Choctaw and related Louisiana Muskogean Indians provided their French and Canadian French partners with a wide variety or menu of foods, processes, and of course the vocabulary for the new culinary traditions called Creole in French and Spanish Louisiana. Among his list of foods they introduced was kumbolichi, our Louisiana filet gumbo, which is preserved in both Louisiana French and Curry-Vini. Sassafras gumbo with chicken, smoked meat, and wild rice and onions he reveals has been documented as far back as 1000 AD. It's also called kumbo ashish by later writers of French Indian heritage. In the early